Okay, let's talk about the region of the Middle East, which is where we have the earliest evidence for this transition from hunting and gathering into farming and herding. Now, it could have been anywhere really, but it just so happens that the earliest occurrence of this seems to have taken place in this region. It didn't take place independently in some regions, as far as we can tell, as we'll see at the end of this chapter. Europe never really developed farming on their own. Europe inherited or adopted farming as an influence from the region of the Middle East through probably population migration and emulation of local inhabitants, of hunters and gatherers that were in contact with these waves of migrants from the Middle East. The evidence all points to some of the earliest of the transition from hunting and gathering into farming and herding taking place in a place that we call, and you've probably heard this term before, the Fertile Crescent. Now, when you think of the Middle East, popular culture tends to sort of visualize it as this vast sand sea, a desert with really just little oases and that sort of an environment. While some of these places do exist, they exist in California too. You know, there's sand and deserts in California, but it's also extremely lush and fertile. A place like Syria, there are some arid environments in Syria, but it's also sitting on one of the most fertile and productive areas in the world. You should think of it more like Nebraska or Kansas than like Nevada or I don't know, New Mexico or something like that has big, vast deserts. And so the Fertile Crescent is the area that sort of feeds the waters of Mesopotamia, which Mesopotamia, the Greek word, means the land between the rivers, Mesopotamos. The rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris are fed by, in the north, in what's now Turkey, the Taurus Mountains. But the Taurus Mountains on to the north, the Zagros to the to the east, and the Lebanon Mountains in the west, all sort of frame this hilly upland area that we refer to as the Fertile Crescent. When you get down a little bit into the plains of Iraq, it's less inhabitable until, as we'll see in later chapters, irrigation. Nobody really lived in Iraq or big areas of Iraq in the lowlands for the periods we're talking about today because there wasn't enough rainfall. People went where there were plants and animals. The rain fell and plants grew. Animals went where there was food, and humans went where animals and plants were. So it all boils down to where the water is. And rain-fed plants are really what humans were interacting with at that time. So the Fertile Crescent is called that because it actually was abundant resources available for people, including things like stands of wild cereals. This is the precursor plants and animals that I was talking about before. Humans were exploiting the resources that were available to them. People in the Middle East didn't ever develop corn or maize because the wild precursor, which is we know to be teosinte, didn't exist there. Instead, there were wild versions of wheat and barley and some legumes like lentils that existed. And those are the things that humans started to select for domestication. Also, the animal species, there were no llamas because there was no wild precursors to those. So you don't get those in the Middle East, but you do eventually get cattle and pigs and sheep and goats and those sort of creatures. So the geography and the environment is important to understand, and think about this is actually quite a productive area that humans lived in. But because it was so productive, it was not inevitable that humans would shift from hunting and gathering into farming and herding, because why? Why would you do that? There's enough abundant resources available. You've got a good diet, you have a good lifestyle, you're reproducing, you're having offspring and children, and they're living their lives. So and it's also not necessarily better for you that you move into hunting and gathering, into farming and herding, as we saw in a previous part of this lecture. So unlike Gordon Child's idea of this being an agricultural revolution, it seemed to be more of a long process with some stages that took place, rather than an outright switch that was turned on and then suddenly everyone became agricultural sedentists. So the stages in this development are sort of the end of during the Ice Ages. You've got Kabaran and geometric Kabaran from about 25,000 to about 15,000 BC. Sorry, not BC, years ago, BP. And then the Natufian period, which we'll talk a little bit about here, is sort of the end of this stage. And it's an important period because you start to see some of the cultural complexities from population increases and interactions with each other. Very strong cultures starting to emerge even before domestication took place. And then you have the Neolithic, and this means the new Stone Age. The Paleolithic is the old Stone Age, or the Epipaleolithic, as it's called in this part of the world, is the sort of the end of the old Stone Age, and the Neolithic, the new Stone Age. And this can be broken down into the early part and the later part. And this generally corresponds to some of the social changes, the architectural changes, and also even the introduction of things like pottery at the end of this period, the late Neolithic. So the Kabaran and geometric Kabaran periods, this early period, was taking place in this fluctuating ice ages. There was a very unstable climate, which meant that it was hard to predict where plants and animals were going to be at any time, intergenerationally, maybe from one year to the next, maybe from one decade to the next. But it's hard to create lifelong patterns that revolve upon reliance upon one place. And so even if people had wanted to settle down and cultivate and produce food, it would have been difficult. They would have had to have changed their strategies quite often. And so the types of communities you see are small camps that were flexible and very mobile hunter-gatherer groups that had particular types of bladelets that they would use for hunting. It was rare to find things like burials and artwork in this time period. And there is no evidence that they, in the Kabaran period, they were cultivating animals or plants. There's no domestication of plants. They're only eating wild grasses, fruits, nuts, animals, which are both large and small fish and birds. One important site that's been found, this is in Israel, Ohalo, which shows a small community, brush huts. This is found partly, at least, submerged, and so there's anaerobic preservation, and so there's very good preservation. So we actually have a lot of good information from Ohalo that shows some of the diverse range of food and survival strategies that these people had. They actually were quite mobile, and they could even perhaps even exchanged with other communities. Then we move into a slightly later period. This is the end of the Ice Age, and things are starting to flatten out in terms of the climate. we're going to hit one final spike of this ice age. I've said that the climate was changing up and down and up and down, and so it was really hard to predict. During the Natufian period, there was an interglacial period that was pretty stable, and the Natufians were making the most of this. And at the end of this period, we have what's called the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas period is an ecological period, or a climate spike that was a period where it got much colder. And so we had the ice ages, were these ups and downs, unstable climate, and then you had a bit of a stabilization, and then you had the Younger Dryas. And then it came back to where we are now, essentially, and that's a very long period of stability. So in the Natufian period, we see some evidence that people were kind of ready to start planning and predicting. They perhaps were at populations that were starting to stabilize in terms of inter-community communication. And you see some shared technology over vast areas of the Middle East. They were using things like these lunate blades, these crescent-shaped microliths that would have been embedded into things like spear or shafts. So multi-component types of hunting implements. But they also had these were also hafted to create like sickles or scythes to cut plants, and we know this because they have what's called sickle gloss on them. It's a sort of a mineral concretion that occurs onto the blades. So we know that people were hunting. We know that people were cutting grasses that existed in the Fertile Crescent. But we also know what they were doing it with these things. They had grinding stones, and they had a fluorescence of decoration and artistic endeavors in this period. The Natufian period is starting to get culturally complex, and this might be because their communities are growing and they're becoming more interactive with each other as well. So the settlements themselves had oval or semicircular structures, sometimes made with stone foundations, often sort of semi-subterranean, and they would leave these dwellings covered with refuse, with rubbish, including tools and animal bones. Some of the structures are unclear of what they were for. Were they domestic? Were they food preparation areas? Some of them were quite large villages. I was talking about previously about megasites. There's some megasites in the late Natufian and early Neolithic that may have even been occupied year-round, which shows that maybe sedentism was starting to occur even before domestication. So you have this little ice age spike towards the end of this, with a rapid onset of much colder weather, and you see, and within one generation, you have just this snap, and suddenly you have an ice age that occurs, and so the number and size of sites decline because the habitable areas are shrinking, and this may actually have increased some of these mega sites, in fact, because I mentioned before, maybe these oases, if you're in a marginal area, you can spread out a little bit. If there's a lot of moisture, if there's a lot of plants and animals, you can spread out in the landscape. But if there's a shrinking population, or if there's a shrinking of these environments, then you might have actually some concentrations taking place. You also have some types of behaviors that start to indicate cultural continuity between generations. And so things like burials become indicative of particular cultural practices. These are also importantly, the burials tend to be within the communities, sometimes under the floors of houses. That may seem really strange to us today, but a deceased relative, a deceased loved one, you wanted them nearby. And this was a different thinking about the cosmos. You wanted them, the ancestor, to be close to you. They were involved in your life, and so you would bury them beneath your floor so you can continue to interact with them. Sometimes the treatment of the dead is a little bit gruesome to us today, but you would remove the skull and maybe sometimes do things with it, like have it for display in your house. And this may seem really kind of strange, but this was a way to honor, perhaps, the dead, your ancestors. Now, this is creating a cultural memory intergenerationally, and with burials, that's actually creating an intergenerational memory, not just between people, but between you and a location, the land. You're burying your memories. That makes you tied to them. So, the Natufian survival strategy was broad spectrum, and this means that they had a wild range of plants. They also they hunted gazelles, and sometimes in huge numbers with traps. They'd drive them into these trapped areas. And also you find dogs that are domesticated at this time, but those are the only domesticated species. And they were quite beloved. You find them sometimes in human burials as well. And there are some genetic changes. So these are developed from wolves, and their genetics are changing into what we would now know as modern dogs. So from this Natufian culture, you have then the after the Younger Dryas, you come out into a period of stability. And it's the same period of stability that we're currently in terms of the climate. And this is when we can start talking about the Neolithic period. So the pre-pottery Neolithic period is the earliest part of the Neolithic, or PPNA as it's called, and then there's the B period, which is slightly later. So the PPNA is about 12 to 11,000 years ago, so about 10,000 BC, something like that. And this is at the end of the Younger Dryas period. And then the PPNB is when you start to see the climate coming, now that it's out of the Younger Dryas, you have the climate improving somewhat. The early Neolithic tool technology goes mainly from, as we talked about, these little microlithic component parts like lunates and bladelets. You start to see things, especially on the mainland of the Middle East, things like arrowheads. And these are, and also you have blades, larger blades, not the little tiny microlithic tools. And the blades are often used for sickles, once again. And so they're continuing this use to be hafted as ways to cut down grasses. You also see axes and adzes for woodworking, and grinding stones for processing plants, like grains especially. You have the development of the use of plaster, which is basically like limestone that's ground up, or gypsum that's ground up, made into a paste, and then you can plaster things. You can plaster floors or walls to preserve them, or you can even make plaster figurines or things like that. Or even vessels. And this seems to be like the precursor to what we'll later see as pottery. So plaster can make quite a good bowl or a vessel. Ceramics require a little bit better pyrotechnology. You need to understand how to control fire to fire pottery. So they could have been sort of playing around with plastic materials like plaster, later to be developed into ceramics. Also in the PPNA, you have settlement size increasing. And you get 20 or 30 families living together in some places with circular mud brick houses like at Netiv Hagdud, and storage pits. So we're going to see that they were starting to develop agriculture. They were starting to develop domesticated plants. If you domesticate plants, you can't eat it all at once. You've got to actually put it someplace. So we see the results of this this shift into agriculturalism with storage pits and storage facilities. Also, larger communities means that you actually organize yourselves slightly differently, and you can do bigger things with bigger groups of people. Jericho, the site of Jericho in Israel, Palestine, is a tell, as we call it, which a tell is like a mound made of cultural material. This one's 30 feet or 9 meters tall, and part of this is a tower that has been found. We don't really know what its function is for, this tower, but it's huge, made of stone, would have required a lot of labor to build, and represents a communal effort to build something big. It could have been for flood protection. It could have been something for that we don't understand, a cultic function of some sort. Also, the villages themselves, like their layout, is sometimes organized as well, even though they're living in sort of sub-rectangular or oval or circular houses. A place like Jurf al-Ahmar in Syria on the banks of the Euphrates, the houses were organized around a central semi-subterranean building that was of different design. It was segmented into this sort of radial shape, and there was a ritual burial before it was completely covered in. The head had been removed of this ritual burial, and that body was lying flat out on the floor. This is a special building for special functions. It was not a residence. It wasn't where people lived. It was a communal building. So you can think in terms of maybe, you can let your imagination run a little bit here. Was it a council house where people organized themselves? Was it a ritual building where special cultic functions were taking place? Were there rites of passage taking place in this? We don't exactly know, but it's interesting to see that communities were organizing themselves in more complicated ways